The following podcast will not feature any trigger warnings and will pay absolutely no attention to considerations of political correctness. No topic shall be outside the realm of discussion, no subject above the plane of reasoning, and no fact beyond questioning. It is our responsibility as individuals, and as humans, but moreover, as the most powerful beings on our planet, to exercise our reason and intellectual honesty to the best of our ability, in order to build a better world for ourselves and for all other beings capable of experiencing it. Welcome to the Thinking Human podcast. I'm George Stewart. In the interests of full disclosure, I'll be wading into some very deep philosophical and conceptual waters today. In today's podcast, I'll explain why I truly believe that there are real objects that don't exist. For instance, unicorns, werewolves, goblins, and ghosts. I claim that all these things are real, physical things, but that none of them actually exist. I'll be arguing mainly against a point made by the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, among others, in his 1948 essay On What There Is. The task of showing that there are real, physical things that do not exist may sound like a paradoxical claim. Indeed, if by something existing one meant something being the case, I would say it would be. Thus, in order to make this argument, I must explain the angle I am approaching this argument from before I begin. In order to illuminate this category of non-existent yet real and physical objects, and thus produce my desired conclusion, I will first need to demonstrate that there is a type of object that can fulfill these seemingly strange criteria of physicality, reality, and non-existence all at the same time. So, to fill this role, I choose thoughts themselves. Thus, in order to demonstrate that there can be real objects that don't exist, I'll produce an argument showing that all thoughts are real and physical objects, and yet some thoughts, while real and physical, don't exist. Unicorns, for example. Having shown thoughts to be these real and physical objects, I'll then define the necessary new definition for existence that I will claim obtains for certain thoughts and not for others, thus proving the claim that there are real objects that don't exist. In his 1948 essay, On What There Is, Willard Van Orman Quine argued that there were no such things as real yet non-existent objects. In doing so, he makes an interesting distinction. That an object, X, and the idea of that object, the so-called X idea, are two different kinds of thing, and thus should not be confused, but often are. In the following quote, Quine talks of a philosopher to whom he gives the pseudonym McX. This is who he refers to in the first line as he. Quote, "Pressed for further details on Pegasus then, he says that Pegasus is an idea in men's minds. Here, however, a confusion begins to be apparent. We may, for the sake of argument, concede that there is an entity, and even a unique entity, though this is rather implausible, which is the mental Pegasus idea. But this mental entity is not what people are talking about when they deny Pegasus. McX never confuses the Parthenon with the Parthenon idea. The Parthenon is physical, the Parthenon idea is mental, according anyway to McX's version of ideas, and I have no better to offer." End quote. Quine states that the idea of a thing, as he puts it, the Parthenon idea, is mental as opposed to physical. He states that when we speak of something such as Pegasus or the Parthenon, we mean to be talking about something real in the world, some actual object, and that we create a confusion by missing this fact. I believe that here Quine overlooked a view of great importance to the subject of non-existent objects. I accept Quine's premise that when we say something like Pegasus is white, we do actually want to be talking about an object in the world. But I will be arguing against Quine's premise that the mental and physical are somehow separate, as in when he states, the Parthenon is physical, the Parthenon idea is mental. I will argue that the mental is physical, and thus that we actually do have real objects to talk of when we describe features of, say, Pegasus. My argument for the physicality of thoughts that I spoke of before will take the following three-premise form. Premise 1. All things that are the case in our universe are real. Premise 2. All real things are physical. And premise 3. All thoughts are real. Given these three premises are true, the conclusion that all thoughts are physical will follow. and given this conclusion, the redefinition of existence can be made sensible. My first premise is that all things that are the case in our universe are real. Quine states in the same paper referenced earlier, quote, "A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover, in a word. Everything. And everyone will accept this answer as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is." End quote. I am saying much the same as this in my first premise. Thus, I will define the terms of my first premise, real and things, as follows. I am defining real as how the universe is independent of perception. I am defining thing as a particular local volume of the universe being a particular way. These definitions are not intended to be vacuous. They are merely intended to be as physically accurate as possible. That is, they are intended to be as non-perception centric as possible. The following will, I hope, demonstrate what I mean. Imagine that in front of me there is a cube and a sphere. Now, it would be true to say that both cube and sphere are sections of the universe. This is to say that neither is any less composed of the universe than the other is. Moreover, neither cube nor sphere is any less a part of the universe than the space around both cube and sphere. Therefore, it seems true to say that locally, the universe can be cube-like, and with no more trouble in a different location, be sphere-like. This applies for all things. They are all just the universe being a particular way locally. Your smartphone is a local part of the universe being a particular way. Thus, if we take real to mean is the case, to assert my first premise, all things that are the case in our universe are real, is to say the universe is as it is. I don't think Quine would disagree, although this is a somewhat different statement than Quine's there is what there is. My second premise is that all real things are physical. If skepticism is to be applied to any of this argument, I see it being applied to this premise most of all. To assert that all real things are physical is to say that there is only the physical. This is bound to be a contentious issue for some. But before being swept away by disagreement, allow me to define the word physical. The shorter Oxford English Dictionary defines physical as of or pertaining to material nature, pertaining to or connected with matter, belonging or relating to natural philosophy or natural science, relating to or in accordance with the regular processes or laws of nature. While this is somewhat suitable, it is also very wide. I will define a narrower, sufficient condition that will retain what I want physical to convey. By sufficient condition, I mean that if anything should have this quality, it will serve as enough to classify it as physical. This sufficient condition of physical I will define as consisting of structure. I am using the standard shorter Oxford English Dictionary definition of structure, which is a fabric or framework of material parts put together, an organised body or combination of mutually connected and dependent parts or elements. Thus, structure implies parts, relations, and actual positions, all things that I want physical to convey. Therefore, from here on, by physical, I will mean at least something consisting of structure. I am making no claim about concepts that may usually be defined as not physical, such as ghosts, God, the human soul, etc. My claim is simply that if these things were to exist, they would have to consist of some form of structure, and thus, according to my definition, they would also be classed as physical. This then brings us to what I see as being the next most likely objection to my second premise. This is the objection that premise 2 is somehow unreasonable. Premise 2 states that all real things are physical. In opposition to this premise, one could do two things in order to object. One could present an example of something that was real but not physical. I refer to this as the deductive objection, as it uses the structure of deductive logic. Or if one could not produce a counterexample such as this, one could argue that the assumption is simply unreasonable. I call this the inductive objection. Both these responses are likely. Thus, I'll detail counters to both of them. First, I'll deal with the deductive objection by rebutting the two types of objects commonly thought to be counters to premise 2. And then I'll deal with the inductive objection by arguing for the reasonability of premise 2 over its negation. First, a counter to the deductive objection. In order to mount the deductive objection, one would need to find an example of something real but not physical. There are two likely candidates for this position that are commonly presented as such types. First, and I would say most common in philosophical circles as an example of something supposed to be real and not physical, is the mental itself, thoughts, feelings, all subjective experience. The second example of one of these strange objects that people may attempt to use as counter to premise 2 is the concept of numbers. I will counter these in order, starting with the mental. The mental cannot be legitimately used as a counter to my argument, because the conclusion that I'm arguing for is that thoughts, or the mental, are actually physical. Thus, to attempt to counter premise 2 by simply asserting that the mental, thoughts, is actually not physical, is just to deny my conclusion arbitrarily. If this is not immediately clear, consider another argument, an objection with the same logical structure. For instance, if someone presented an argument with the same form as mine, such as the following: Premise 1, all things are wooden. Premise 2, all wooden things are brown. Premise 3, all doors are wooden. Therefore, all doors are brown. In order to deny that all wooden things are brown, it would be illegitimate to state that doors are wooden things that are not brown, because this would be to simply deny the conclusion of the argument which states that all doors are brown. This is obviously a false conclusion, given that we can look at doors in our surroundings in the real world and determine that some are, in fact, not brown. But the principle remains the same. Thus, if we were arguing for some conclusion that we cannot simply observe to determine, such as the mental being physical, then we cannot simply assert the negation of the conclusion in order to counter one of the premises. The second contender, often considered real but not physical, are the abstract concepts of numbers. The structure of my argument, however, requires that in order for such cases of admittedly mysterious mathematical principles to be presented as successful counterexamples to my second premise, they will need to fulfill both of two criteria to avoid becoming logically fallacious. The first being that cases of such mathematical principles must be presented as evidence such that they are not instantiated by physical objects in the world, i.e. 2 cups, 3 dogs, and so on. As to demonstrate supposedly non-physical principles using yet more physical objects seems to simply be evidence that abstract concepts require physical instantiation in order to exist. This obviously could not count as evidence against my second premise. The second criteria states that types of abstract principles like numbers, if they are to be presented as evidence of counterexamples to my second premise, not be presented as concepts, as concepts imply thoughts, which thus implies that some thoughts, namely concepts, are not physical, and this, as I detailed before when talking about the case of the mental, denies my conclusion arbitrarily, and thus results in a similar logical fallacy to that which I detailed in the case of the mental. Thus, having laid out these preemptive counters, I'll move on to rebutting the inductive objection. An inductive objection would usually come in the form of an objector saying something similar to the following. Objector: you have not and cannot experience all things in the universe. Thus, you cannot make the judgment of all things that they are physical. Thus, although an example of an object that is real and not physical has not been demonstrated, your second premise, that all real things are physical, can be discounted nonetheless, because it is an unreasonably large and all-encompassing assumption. In other words, you haven't and cannot experience all things in the universe, and therefore you cannot reasonably judge that they are all physical. This objection presumes that some parts of the universe are not physical, and that to presume otherwise is somehow arrogant, when in reality, physical things are all that we know to be real. Indeed, try as I might, I cannot conceive of a concept that has no form of structure. Therefore, according to my earlier definition of structure, all I can conceive is the physical. People claim to be able to conceive of the physical realm and the non-physical realm. But I believe this is a misunderstanding of their own thought. I don't think the term non-physical is actually coherent. To say that a thing is not physical is to say that it has absolutely no form of structure at all. And I don't know of a conceptual way that something could be the case in reality without some form of structure. Thus it seems to me that the inductive objection actually has its motivations backwards. All that my second premise states is that the nature of the universe that we have observed, being physical, continues into the places in the universe that we have not observed. Thus, before one objects that premise 2 is an unreasonable assumption, one would need a more reasonable alternative to go in its place. And it seems to me that claiming without any examples of evidence whatsoever that some very specific parts of the universe, namely our thoughts, are exactly opposite in basic formation to anything that we have ever observed, indeed, given the case I have just made, different than anything that can even be conceptualized, strikes me as the opposite of a reasonable alternative. Thus, it's hard to see with these two objections dealt with how one could further object to premise 2. I will leave this up to you. My third premise states that all thoughts are real. Je pense donc je suis. I think so I am. Descartes, 1637. In order to deny premise 3, one would either have to deny that thoughts are real, or one would have to deny premise 2. Since I'm using the word thoughts as a synonym for the mental, it seems that the claim made by a person that thoughts are not real, denying premise 3, would have to rest on some prior subjective mental happening. This claim would thus seem rather self-contradictory, being that the claimer would have had to think of it. Therefore the pressure must again fall on premise 2 to support the majority of my argument and resist collapse. If I have shown that premises 1 to 3 are true, then I can draw the conclusion, contrary to Quine, that thoughts are physical objects. Indeed, very interesting physical objects, as they look a certain way to the brain that produces them, but a different way to an outside observer of said brain. Thus, when Quine said, quote, "The Parthenon is visible, the Parthenon idea is invisible," end quote, he was not being accurate. The physical object in the brain that we would call the Parthenon idea is not invisible at all, but in fact is visible in two ways from two viewpoints. It is visible as something that looks like the Parthenon to the subject whose brain produces it, and to them in this way alone. But it would also be visible as a pattern in the brain to any third party who had the required technology to find it. Presumably, the pattern in the brain and the Parthenon that I see in my mind are one and the same, and thus can be thought of as an object that appears differently depending on one's point of view. Of course, I'm not saying that in remembering the Parthenon one is literally seeing one's brain from a first-person view, but I am saying that to a given mind produced by a given brain, the activity of said brain, which, if my logic is correct and my definitions hold, we can refer to as a physical object, does indeed appear differently to that said brain than it does to other brains located in other persons looking on from different perspectives. My conclusion is that all thoughts are physical. In order to make my conclusion more intuitive, consider the following example. The electrical signals that travel to your computer's monitor are interpreted by the monitor in order to create the images that you see on the screen. The signals sent to the monitor do not look like the images on the screen. They are physical, they have structure, and yet, if you are a computer monitor receiving signals, then all you will see are images, not signals. Similarly to this, I am claiming that your brain is processing signals which are quite real and quite physical, which because they are being processed by your brain appear to you as images, sounds, smells, and so on, but which if viewed from outside your brain would appear as only patterns of chemicals and electricity. Therefore, granting that I have established my conclusion well enough, that thoughts are physical and thus real, it seems that we have a whole category of real things that, while real and physical, do not reflect objects in the world outside our brains. This being the case, I have invented some new terminology in order to complete my argument and show how there can be real things that do not exist. The three new terms that I've created are as follows: mental object, corresponding outer world object, and mental analogue. They function as follows. Any conceivable object or concept in the mind, regardless of its correspondence to an object in the outside world, can be called a mental object. A corresponding outer world object is simply any object in the outside world that corresponds in subjective appearance to a mental object. In other words, if I ask you to imagine a car, this will be a mental object. Then if I were to show you an actual car that matched your mental object of a car, this would be your mental object's corresponding outer world object. A mental analogue is a mental object that is paired with its corresponding outer world object. For example, Quine's Parthenon idea is not, as Quine seems to suggest, simply a mental object, but is actually a mental analogue, as its corresponding outer world object is the Parthenon itself. The reason I call a mental object paired with its outer world object a mental analogue is that the mental object Parthenon idea, because it is a physical pattern in the brain, is a mentally realised physical analogy of the outer world object we call the Parthenon. I'll make the point again because it's of the utmost importance to my argument. If we accept that thoughts are physical objects in the brain, then the Parthenon idea is a mentally realised physical analogy of the real Parthenon. Thus, it's a mental analogue of the real Parthenon. My claim in this argument is that all of the above categories, mental objects, corresponding outer world objects, and mental analogues, are real, but only mental analogues exist. How can I claim this? Because I am claiming that existence is the relational fact of a mental analogue paired with its corresponding outer world object. Thus, I'm claiming that when we talk of something being real, we are talking of something being the case, the universe being a particular way. But when we talk of something existing, we are talking of a mental object and its relationship to an object in the outside world. To turn back to Quine, when I say something like, Pegasus is white, I am making a claim about how a particular mental object appears to me subjectively. Of course, I'm not actually saying that there is an actual corresponding outer world object, a winged horse in the world named Pegasus, and that winged horse is white. But I am, nonetheless, talking about a feature of a real physical object. Thus, in a literal sense, I am saying there is a real object, and we call this object Pegasus. And when viewed subjectively, this object looks white. Conclusion. If premises 1 to 3 are true, then my conclusion that all thoughts, all mental objects, are physical is also true. Therefore, the set of all possible mental objects, including Pegasus, the Parthenon idea, Sherlock Holmes, and so on, are just as real and physical as outside worldly objects like laptops, tables, chairs, etc. Given this conclusion, it made sense to define some new terms regarding the concept of existence in order to make sense of this counterintuitive reality. These are the concepts of mental objects, corresponding outer world objects, and mental analogues that I talked of a moment ago. Using these terms, an explanation of existence can be constructed as a mental object paired with its corresponding outer world object to form a mental analogue, and thus fulfill the relationship needed for existence. Therefore, existence can be defined as a state of mentally realised physical analogy between a mental object and a corresponding outer world object, otherwise called a mental analogue. Thus, while all three terms, mental objects, corresponding outer world objects, and mental analogues, designate real things, only mental analogues fulfill the criteria for existence. This definition, therefore, neatly clears up the messy problem that philosophers such as Meinong encountered when claiming that things like unicorns existed on some mysterious level. Unicorns do not exist, according to my definitions. Even though they are real and physical mental objects, they do not correspond, as far as we can tell, to objects in the world outside brains. At this point, you may be tempted to ask something like the following. Just what is the point of all this? You're telling me you have a proof that shows me that everything I already knew didn't exist, doesn't exist. Then what has this got to do with anything? Good question. You may have thought before all this that unicorns, werewolves, and fairies didn't exist. But you also thought they weren't real, and this is where you were wrong. There are not werewolves in the forest or fairies in the garden, but what my argument has shown is that while these things don't exist, because the mental objects don't correspond to objects outside of the brain, they are real things. Unicorns are real. It's just that they don't look like white horses with horns on their head. They look like brain patterns. To close, given that I have defined existence as a relational term referring to a mental object and its correspondence with an outer world object, any mental object that does not have a corresponding outer world object is a real thing that does not exist. Thus, opposing Quine and explaining the title of this podcast, this is why I believe that there are real things that don't exist. If you enjoy the Thinking Human podcast and want to support it, there are currently several ways that you can do this for free. You can like and share this podcast wherever you find it. You can subscribe to the Thinking Human YouTube channel, and you can visit my personal website at georgestewart.wordpress.com.